So first of all, I'm just going to go ahead and talk about their speeches and their arguments and point out why our arguments are better. So first of all, one of their biggest arguments is that the socioeconomic differences between different people causes lesser education and causes that achievement gap, which we all see. Yet, when we look to schools, we can see that it can be the best school, but it matters which classes you take. And in the story of Kenneth Quinn, he was a 4-level student and was ahead of most of his people, and so he took a better class. Yet when he got there, he was pretty much taken over by the white majority in the classroom. And seeing as the teacher was white, they obviously took more precedence over Kenneth Quinn and his African-American friends. So he was practically ignored in his classroom, and like my partner already pointed out, they weren't comfortable with asking their teacher for help when something didn't make sense or they just simply needed help on the homework. And that is why we see this achievement gap. It's not because of the socioeconomic status, because that school was actually a really good school, just. He wasn't comfortable with being the minority in a classroom and being ignored because of being that minority. So, on to their point about test scores being low because of the socioeconomic status. We can see this among many Black and Latino students over America. And once again, it's not because of the socioeconomic status, but just because they might have to be taking those lower classes, just because of being uncomfortable, not being able to ask teacher for questions, just because they're uncomfortable with feeling that they might be ignored or that they aren't important as their other classmates are. So, pretty much in conclusion, as long as we have racial segregation like we do de facto, that no matter what we do, we have to target that specific area. Because it doesn't really matter if you're rich or poor, but if you go into a classroom and feel ignored, you're not going to want to stay there. You're going to want to leave and find people that understand you and people you can relate to. And that doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, but when you are ignored just based upon a race, you figure it out. And you figure out that you need people that are either Black, Latino, or even white in schools that have white minorities. So, with anything that we have to do with this, we have to figure out the achievement gap between white, Latino, and Black students. And nothing's going to get better if we don't figure that out. Thank you much.
Ridiculous for me to come up here and claim that there is absolutely no racial segregation in schools. However, what my partner and I are claiming is that socioeconomic classes have more of an effect on our widening achievement gap than solely race. The opposing team has asserted that race alone is the largest cause of de facto segregation. While this may have been true in the past, socioeconomic classes are becoming the leader of de facto segregation and can also be held responsible for segregation due to race. According to the Washington Post on September 9, 2012, nobody disputes that socioeconomic status, cultural identity, and the educational level of parents, especially mothers, are linked to the stubborn achievement gap between students of different races and ethnicities. Children from poor families do worse than kids from middle class and wealthy families. Children do better if their mother has a college degree, and overall, children of all ethnicities and races do better in schools with less than 25% of students' population coming from low-income families. It just so happens that Latinos, African Americans, and other racial minorities fall within the lower socioeconomic classes. Those groups with a history of being affected by racial segregation are typically those affected by socioeconomic segregation as well, because in the past their parents weren't educated and now they aren't as well, meaning they're in the neighborhoods where people with socioeconomic classes go, and therefore in the schools where socioeconomic classes define them. As my partner and I have previously stated, poverty is colorblind, and people of all races are crushed by this widening achievement gap, not just African Americans or other minorities. The Atlantic wrote on February in 2012 that when it comes to college completion rates, the rich-poor gulf has grown by 50% since the 1980s. Upper-income families are also spending vastly more on their children compared to the poor than they did 40 years ago. And they're spending more time as parents cultivating their intellectual development. Later, the article goes on to say that today there is a much stronger connection between income and a child's academic success than in the past. Having money is simply more important than it used to be when it comes to getting a good education. Or, as Stanford professor Reedon puts it, a dollar of income appears to buy more academic achievement than it did several decades ago. Children who grow up with educated parents are likely on the higher end of the achievement gap because they're raised with more money and can either buy a better education or can afford to take other classes and are allowed better resources than others. Their parents likely make more money, and because they're educated, provide a more culturally aware and educational home life, which will later affect them when they get to high school. These children are more likely to read before they enter grade school and have a wider vocabulary because they've had access to these different resources and cultures. When they get to high school, those with more money often find they have parents that push them into those higher level classes and tell them to do better when they fail. Whereas those in lower socioeconomic classes usually focus more on survival or passing the class than getting the A. Therefore, socioeconomic segregation has a more potent effect on today's school system because it creates socioeconomic segregation alone and also leads to a wider development of racial segregation as well. So we need to focus on our socioeconomic gap and the achievement gap before we can solve racial segregation. I'm ready for questions.
Would you like to ask the first question?
Sure. So in your speech you reference Quinn, I think is the last name, and how they felt awkward in their class. Does Quinn's awkwardness with asking the teacher a question show actual segregation, or just Quinn's awkwardness of asking a question?
No, we saw it in many of the other African American students in the minorities within that classroom. It's not just them being awkward, it's actually feeling uncomfortable because of the race that you have, or that you see that most of your students in your classroom are white, and your teacher is white, and they target those white students more, and they make sure they understand it more. And you find your minority students sitting in the corner of the classroom being scared to ask a question.
Okay, do Caucasian students never feel awkward asking their teacher questions because they're white? Or is it solely a minority-based, feeling of being uncomfortable with being involved in class, I guess?
That uncomfortable feeling